Okay, so good afternoon, all, and thank you for joining this webinar on the budget hosted by ELP TIOL. We have eminent panel with us today. While we are waiting for Mr. Nantani to join, he will join. He doesn't need an introduction. A senior counsel specializing in tax matters. We have Mr. Singh, ex-member of tribunal. We have Nishant Shah, our partner at ELP, and myself, Rohit Jain, monitoring the webinar. We had one of the bold budget. I think we are seeing as India projecting a lot of bold actions, be it the last test cricket match at Australia or our finance minister has taken a lot of bold steps while announcing the budget 2021. There have been significant good developments of the proposals, while there are certain misses. But as we need to start looking at the budget, first cover what have been announced in this budget, and then get into the analysis and impact of those provisions. What has not been done, I think we will leave it to for the next time. Let's get into the presentation now. What we intend to cover in this presentation today is some budget highlights, then we have investment promotion measures. Then there are some substantive changes which have been made and assessments and dispute resolution. So we would cover all of our entire clauses or key clauses of the budget proposals divided into these four baskets. Let's go quickly with the budget highlights. And what FM has to table in this particular budget is from the direct tax perspective. One of the highlight of the budget is there has been no change in the income tax rates. We were expecting that on account of pandemic there would be some COVID says there would be something, but the phrase which was mostly spoken prior to the budget, that raise the resources without raising the taxes, have actually come true. The finance minister has actually delivered that without raising the tax rates have effectively raised various resources for the expenditure on the infra side, on the capex side, and that's really a good development in the context of direct tax. Some of them are other developments. Depreciation or goodwill is prohibited. Slum cell definition also expanded. Equalization levy scope clarified. The tax holiday for startup extended for a year. Very significant development for all our non-resident or seeking the clarity in relation to some matters, which is advanced ruling has been reconstituted. Faceless proceedings at ITAT, MAT provisions amended for dividends, APAs and secondary adjustments, and disallowance of delayed contribution towards employees' social security. I think these are the key amendments on the direct tax side. While when we look at it, indirect tax, also there have been certain important amendments, whether it's in terms of ITC matching necessary for availment, export rebate now confined to notified supplies and stringent conditions for forex realization. We will take you through all those provisions in detail. C-form based concessional tax rate is also restricted. Completion of custom investigations made time bound now. New cess got introduced while remain cost. Conditional customs duty exemptions to be valid only for 2 years now. Self-certification instead of GST audit, and entire customs tariff has been overall effectively to align with HSN 2022. So these are the very high level highlights of budget. Before I get into and take a deep dive on some of the relevant provisions and analyze the impact, I would just start with asking Nishant, how do you really overall rate this budget? And then I would request Mr. Singh to rate very high level a few comments on the budget, please.
Yeah, hi Rohit. Rohit, I would agree to the first statement you made that the finance minister the honorable finance minister has really taken a bold step by not increasing the tax rates and the tax burden, and I would call it as a bold budget. But more effectively, I would call it as a growth-oriented budget. I would say for two specific reasons. One being that uh, while the finance minister has kept certain amount of expenditure by the deficit that we are seeing identified, it has not resulted into any overburden on by increasing the tax rate. the expectation of achieving or receiving the amounts is from the perspective of the growth that will be seen in the economy, and maybe the growth will spiral into this. In addition to that, the finance minister has focused on privatization, which is again another bold step, and the reliance on the external debt which will be coming in, which I think altogether are all relating to a growth oriented perspective. Just one last point is that the finance minister, while announcing the budget, has very clearly set out a number of effective provisions which have gone to create an ease of doing business in India, which again, I want to realign to the growth aspect to say that the growth is not just inherent growth, but through the external attraction of foreign funds coming in. And, she has focused on both the normal Make in India sort of initiative, which will be extended, as also the initiative from the perspective of drawing in funds coming in through making it attractive for funds to invest into the country. So net, I would say a very bold, effective budget, a need for the time, and it will only be the manner in which it is executed over a period of time that will show the effectiveness of the announcements made.
Thank you, Nishant. Mr. Singh, your take on the budget?
Thank you, Rohit. I do not think I'm very competent to comment about the overall quality of the budget, but I'll confine myself to the indirect taxation part of it, where I think I can make some comments. If I want to summarize the budget as far as the indirect taxation is concerned, I would call spade a spade. I think the provisions which are being changed make the indirect taxation more intolerant, more punitive, and to my mind, less trade friendly. And I'll make good on these comments when individual sections are taken up. Some of the changes are of questionable constitutionality. Some changes are very vaguely worded. Some changes are very sweeping, too sweeping to be sustainable, and some changes are purely avoidable. But as I said, when you take up section by section, we can comment on that there.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. There are, apart from the tax, there are certain policy amendments. So the important being the decriminalization of LLP Act, FDI in insurance is increased to 74 from 49, reiteration of PLI budget allocation for 13 sectors, and PLI is something where a lot of industry is looking at it so that they could claim certain incentive on doing some additional capex, additional manufacturing in India. 7 mega textile parks, implementing dispute resolution committee, new economic corridors and infra boost, hopefully reduce the logistic cost, and financial incentives for digital payments. These are certain high-level policy amendments which have also happened as part of the budget. Without wasting much of a time in terms of highlights, let's straight get into the first part of our presentation, which is investment promotion, attracting investments, attracting manufacturing in India. What are the proposals and what is the impact of that? First being to start with the direct tax. Incentives, particularly for REITs and InvITs and FPIs. What has been proposed now? That enabling of debt financing of InvIT and REITs by FPIs and exemption from TDS on dividend payment by SPVs, investee company to REITs and InvITs. So I would request Nishant to take us through in terms of the background and impact of this on way forward. And then we'll get into the next slide also, which is very interesting development on a direct tax, which would also boost the import. Yeah, go on, Nishant.
Sure.
Nishant, we can't hear you.
Okay. Just okay. Am I audible now, Rohit?
Yes, now audible. Yes, please.
Okay. So let me, like I mentioned during the first part on the budget aspect, very clearly the certain proposals in the budget are those to attract new investments into the country. And this slide very clearly reflects some of those aspects. And I was referring to the investments brought in by InvIT. So, there has been clearly a different a bunch of provisions which have been introduced, which are to iron out concerns which were being faced by funds and by investors. Let me focus on two specific ones which are covered in this slide. One is for InvITs, which is the infrastructure focused funds, and for REITs, which is the real estate focused funds. One is that they have opened up a debt financing facility, which can allow financing to be coming in the form of debt into these funds, which is nothing to do with tax. But more importantly, the issue which was being faced is the funds would be investing into, the investors would be bringing in their money into these REITs or InvITs, as we call them. And these REITs or InvITs will be investing into an SPV company, which would be a real estate company or an infrastructure company. Now, obviously, because of the investment made, there was a dividend which was flowing back, and there were two legs of the dividend. As of now, prior to this proposed amendment, the dividend was taxable at both the legs. This was resulting into blockage of funds in the hands of the REITs or InvITs. So, to avoid this blockage, an amendment has been brought in just to make it much more conducive and effective for these InvITs and REITs to exempt the dividend which is received by these InvITs or REITs. So, this clearly is a impact which will boost investment into real estate funds, the trust, as well as the InvITs. Very clearly a welcome move. The second part, which is again another very effective amendment, is that FPIs, which are investing from outside, there was a provision under 196D which used the words to say that as the rate prescribed in the provision. As a result, the dividend paid to FPIs was subject to 20% because 20% was the rate prescribed in the provision, even though the investor would have been eligible to a lower rate under the double tax avoidance agreement. Now, if you see a lot of other provisions, it has always been whichever is more beneficial, whereas that was not a position when we read the section 196D. So to overcome that issue, 196D also has now been modified to say that whichever is the favorable rate, whichever is the effective rate will be applicable in case of dividends which is paid to FPIs, and therefore a conducive scenario has become available. So that's on REITs and InvITs, where very clearly a beneficial provision has been brought in to bring in more funds. The other correlated bunch of provisions are the provisions in relation to investments being brought into IFSC. IFSC, as we know, is the brainchild of the Honorable Prime Minister, and he's been looking into the IFSC, promotion of the IFSC, that is the International Financial Services Center in the GIFT City in Gujarat. Now, a few benefits have been announced there. So, the first benefit is in relation to aircraft leasing companies. Aircraft leasing companies that want to operate from IFSC by setting up a unit there, they obviously on their income, they are eligible for exemption under Section 80. What this provision brings out is that if an aircraft leasing company sets up base there, there was a concern that if the aircraft was later on required to be sold, there would be a capital gains arising on the IFSC unit. This provision now exempts that capital gains. So it makes it really attractive for aircraft leasing companies to set up base in the IFSC. Second is, a lot of aircrafts in the country are right now leased by an aircraft leasing company which is located outside the country. If they set up base, there would be a first leg of lease from outside the country to the IFSC unit, and from the IFSC unit to the domestic aircraft operator. The first leg of lease again would require to payment of lease rentals in the form of royalty. Provision has also been incorporated to exempt any rental paid by the IFSC unit to the foreign lease provider of the aircraft. So, two levels of benefits brought in. Very clearly, it is to attract aircraft leasing companies to set up base in IFSC. I think this provision would make sort of IFSC as another jurisdiction, some of the global jurisdictions like Ireland, which provide these kind of taxing environment, which has resulted into aircraft leasing companies setting up base in that country. I think government has done an excellent job by bringing that in. The second bunch of exemptions in relation to IFSC units are again of similar nature, where under Section 80 LA, there are various benefits given to the funds which operate in the IFSC through an IFSC unit, either as a banking, offshore banking unit or similar units. The issue was that when the fund is transferred into IFSC, or if the investor in the fund was enjoying some sort of a benefit, say under the erstwhile Mauritian treaty, and that benefit was enjoying a grandfathering provision, will the transfer of the fund into IFSC result into redundancy of that benefit? The answer is yes, there was a doubt on that. These provisions now make it very clear that the transfer of the fund will not result into capital gains. Also, the original investor, if he was enjoying an exemption from capital gains because of the erstwhile India-Mauritius treaty, that benefit will continue. And there was indirectly a grandfathering provision has been incorporated into these new provisions that has been brought in. Last part is in relation to certain relaxations which have been brought in relation to the eligible investment and the eligible investor fund, which again is yet to be notified. But there are specific provisions under section 9A, and 9A3, 9A4 provides a number of restrictions or a number of conditions to be satisfied. The government has created an enabling provision to dilute or liberalize some of these provisions as applicable to these funds if they see potential in bringing in those funds into investing into the country. So net, like we said, it's a budget which is again bringing in very effective provisions for attracting funds to be investing into the country. And my belief is that these provisions will now make the IFSC a really attractive place for funds to set up base and aircraft leasing companies to set up shop and operate from. Yeah, Rohit.
Thank you, Nishant. I think clearly some of these developments would help in attracting the investments. But
Absolutely.
When we get into the next one, some of the deterrent in terms of the provisions were discontinuation of depreciation on goodwill. So in a lot of M&A transactions, slump sale, consolidation, where there has been transfer of an undertaking or an entity, there has been whatever is the book value of asset minus liabilities and the differential considerations, typically book this as a goodwill. And most of the cases, in fact, the buyer claims this goodwill as a depreciable asset and claims the depreciation under section 32. There have been some unintended benefits have been taken, the structuring have been done to therefore overcome some of these provisions. Now there has been specific discontinuation or bar to treat goodwill as a depreciable asset under section 32 of the Income Tax Act. This is clearly overcome, or there was a settled position now in the context of SIMF securities, where Supreme Court has already considered this being a depreciable asset. Now going forward, this won't be considered as a depreciable asset, and it has a significant impact according to us. First, the disallowance of depreciation in all situations without making any distinction that whether this is self-generated, whether this is actually paid goodwill, where there has been consideration has been paid towards this goodwill. No distinction whatsoever has been made, and therefore every goodwill which has been created at the time of transactions of slump sale, M&A deal, that will not be considered as depreciable asset. This would clearly impact the payback calculation in every commercial M&A deal, as depreciation on goodwill was an essential element in calculating post-tax return of an acquisition proposals, because this was making sense that if I could pay a higher consideration and treat this as a depreciable asset, and I can very well claim this as deductible depreciation and effectively have some tax arbitrage or a tax saving in relation to such proposal. And the most important thing that we would like to bring to your notice is that the depreciation on other identifiable intangibles other than goodwill shall continue to be available to the buyer. So when somebody buys the business or an undertaking, they also buy in terms of the trademark, the know-how, the other licensing that that entity has or that undertaking has. Now the real question comes up, how do you value such sort of intangible assets? While goodwill is one of the assets which has been considered as non-depreciable, what will happen to all of these other assets which I am actually buying along with the business, and I need to now start doing hair splitting of the consideration, not only on the book value of other assets, but also valuing other intangible assets and start identifying consideration for those assets and then still be able to claim this as a depreciation. I think whether it is practicably possible, whether this will have some sort of in terms of the implementation of this sort of a provision is in the interest of the revenue, or effectively it will ultimately entail a lot of other disputes, is something to be seen. But this is definitely a provision which is a talk of the town, particularly in the context of not allowing the depreciation or the goodwill which has been created in mostly in M&A or slum sale deals. The next important, just a clarificatory type of an amendment, which is now we had a judgment in Bharat Bijli Bombay High Court that when there was a transfer of an undertaking by means of slum sale, it was considered to be a taxable transactions and been taxed as a capital gain. Whereas if it is transferred not by way of a sale, but it was through other non-monetary considerations such as exchange, such as barter, then it was not considered as a slum sale of a undertaking. Now the specific provision has been made as a clarificatory, of course, effective prospectively, where it has been said that the definition of slum sale will also include the transfer of undertaking by any means. Effectively, the provision itself got amended. Therefore, all types of transfer of undertaking are now sought to be covered under the provisions of slum sale. Most important thing again here is, how do I really compute? When I really want to offer this to a tax, I need to value the consideration that I am receiving in while transferring the undertaking. So while I'm transferring an undertaking, I am something receiving as a non-monetary consideration. And that non-monetary consideration could be in the form of some other assets. It could be form of immovable property. It could be a form of other businesses or other undertakings. How do I really value? There has been no specific guidelines been provided as of now as we speak. Once this notification or this budget becomes a finance act, and we may see that there may be some rules which may get amended. But as we speak today, there is no guidelines been provided in relation to computation of this non-monetary consideration. And this is very important. When we look at it, similarly, a GST provisions, we do have certain specific valuation sections which provides for the non-monetary consideration and how do I value those equivalent to the market value of that consideration. Will I need to really adopt the same principles? Do I need to go like a Rule 11 UA sort of a concept where I value based on what is the assets, whether it's immovable property, movable property, less liabilities, and then value that in relation to calculation of this slum sale as an exchange being a taxable event. Very important change, and the benefit which used to be claimed by relying on the Bharat Bijli case has no more been available. Other and the most critical one is from the indirect tax perspective to boost Make in India. There have been significant amendments which have been made under the Customs Tariff Act. Some of them are trade remedies, which are removal or temporary suspension of CVD and ADD on certain products. Very, very important amendments. So there was a duty which was imposed on certain goods, and those duties, which is anti-dumping duty or a countervailing duties, have been suspended for some time. That would effectively mean that the domestic manufacturers are getting advantage of an import parity price, particularly in the steel segment where the prices have really gone up significantly. Now there has been some impact on the domestic sector here, where the import has now become a little cheaper on a suspension of this CVD or anti-dumping duty. There are tariff changes, which has duty increase to promote local manufacturer. Various products have been notified under which the duties have gone up from 5% to almost 35%. In some of the cases where there have been significant hike in the customs duty, so that there is a boost to get some local manufacture in India and support the domestic manufacturer. Important is rationalization to avoid inverted structure. There have been statements made by the Honorable Finance Minister, where she has made it very clear that there will be a concrete steps will be taken, particularly from a GST as well, where the inverted duty structure that will be get eliminated. Industry is looking for of this sort of a measure. It was in fact slated to be part of a GST Council meeting, but it couldn't taken up as an agenda. Hopefully sooner that will be taken up, and we would see the result of all of this inverted duty structure, be it in a mining sector, be it in a textile, be it in other food products. There have been a lot of inverted duty structure which exists today, which should get eliminated. And this will also be important, keeping in mind that what we get into the specific rebate sort of a provisions, which has now been restricted only for a specified product. Then we have agri-cess, which is effectively, agri-cess is introduced only for the purpose of allocation of funds for a specified purpose, while it does not have an impact on a consumer as such, because to that extent, the customs duty rates have been reduced and the new agri-cess has been imported. Important amendment on the concessional import rules, where we all know that when goods have been imported under the customs rules of a concessional rate of duty, it was required to be used only at an importer at its own unit. There was a difficulty or an interpretation which was existed, whether can I give this goods for the job work purpose. So I import a raw material on a concessional rate of import duty. Can I really give this to outsource for a job work purposes and then remove the goods from there directly as well? Was this been possible, or do I need to carry out certain activity in my own unit before the job work would be done? I think that has now been permitted specifically. Customs exemption will be reviewed. There are in proposal to review more than 400 exemptions, particularly all of these exemptions which have lived its life, they have become redundant. All of these exemptions will be reviewed. Finance Minister made it clear that mid of October or start of October, all of these old exemption notifications, which may not be necessary today, will be removed. The most important point that she had made, that there will be an industry consultation which will happen. And I'm sure that if we are taking a benefit of certain old exemption notification, we need to be careful. If we need to make a representation, we should bring out to the notice of the policy makers that there are these exemptions which are still relevant even today's date, be it their old notifications, but it has to continue. And PLI scheme and the importance there has been re-emphasized here clearly. PLI is one of the big measure which has been taken from the indirect tax or incentive perspective to attract investment into India. Before I go to my next stage of amendments or a proposal, I would request if Mr. Singh has any specific comments on this indirect tax provisions which have been covered, which will boost Make in India.
You have rightly pointed out that the changes in the duty structure are all designed and aimed at improving the manufacturing sector in the country, and they have been well received. As a matter of fact, in Customs Tariff Act, certain amendments have been made, which have also removed the inconsistencies which were prevalent. For example, when the anti-dumping duty products were imported by the EOU, the anti-dumping duty was not levied. But if those products or the goods manufactured out of those products were cleared by the EOU in the domestic market, then the ADD had to be levied. Similar provision did not exist on the countervailing duty side. So that has been done. More importantly, there was, what was happening was that at some point of time, the ADD or the CVD would be absorbed, so to say, and there was no provision to review it when the whole thing got absorbed by recalibrating the whole thing. That has been allowed as per the amendments made in the Customs Tariff Act. So those are important ones. But overall, the customs notifications review will cleanse the whole cluttering up. My only concern was that they have made a provision that all the conditional exemption notifications will expire by 31st March, 2 years hence. Now, it sounds good, but actually it will create a lot of difficulty, because if they renew it or if they renew it or extend it, normally those extensions are done at the last minute, which throws off the trade of balance. And therefore, I think it was no need to do that. They could always withdraw a notification whenever they wanted, rather than saying everything will lapse unless we extend it. It's a negative way of putting it, and the trade probably could take it up.
That's right, Mr. Singh. I think you are right that if we have covered those provisions of 2 years and lapsing of that as a provisions, and we will cover that in detail. I thought Vikram Bhai has joined the webinar. Sir, are you there?
Not yet, I think, Rohit.
Okay, fine. We'll wait for him to join and take all the comments from him on all of these points again. Let's get to the most important provision which is bothering and which has been matter of dispute since implementation of GST. Since July 17, we know that there was an issue where if I am a manufacturing the goods or I'm using the goods in mining, generation of electricity, or in terms of the telecommunication, can I really issue Form C and buy the goods at a concessional rate of CST? And which are those goods? Primarily the petroleum products. So be it natural gas, be it diesel, petrol. So can I really buy these goods by issuing of a Form C? When in July 17, the interpretation which has been taken that for the purpose of Section 8, the goods needs to be interpreted in a context in which it is used. And therefore, as long as I am buying the goods for mining, as long as I am buying the goods for carrying out the activity of manufacture and sale, I should be entitled to issue Form C. That interpretation initially has been not been accepted by the authorities, and they were reluctant to issue Form C. And lot of writ petitions got filed across various high courts, starting from Mumbai to Goa High Court to Delhi to Rajasthan to Gujarat, all of the places where the writ petitions got filed. And post filing of writ petitions, there have been positive, clear judgments ultimately by the Supreme Court also, which says that the CFOM will be allowed to buy the petroleum products even in relation to manufacture of goods which are liable to GST. Now, when we look at it, the proposed amendment under the CST Act, they have made it very clear that the Form C will be allowed only for the petroleum industry. That means if you are dealing or reselling the petroleum products, or you are buying something for use in the manufacture of a petroleum products, and very large impact for various sectors. Now you will be either forced to buy the goods within the state by paying higher VAT, or you would be buying the goods from outside the state but paying the full rate of VAT as applicable in that particular state, because the concessional rate of CST of 2% won't be available going forward. What I would take it that industry was actually expecting something different. Industry first expecting that some of these petroleum products which are of an industrial use should ideally come in part of a GST, such as natural gas. Some of the petroleum products which are used in the industry should form part of a GST itself, so that we eliminate the cascading effect of tax, we eliminate the non-creditable tax, because that was the only objective of introduction of GST. Unfortunately, that has not happened. There has been absolutely no reference whatsoever of inclusion of certain petroleum products in GST. At the same time, industry was expecting some more clarity should be provided on the Form C issues, where when I'm buying the goods for use in the manufacture and sale, that should be allowed. Unfortunately, that also has not happened. In fact, it has reverse way. Now it is restricted to only for the petroleum products. Huge impact in terms of the cost for a lot of our companies, those who are buying the goods outside the state at a concessional rate of duty. The benefit no more will be available in relation to this sort of an aspect. I think very critical to be seen. There is still a small benefit which could be potentially looked at it, that if the VAT rate in your state where you are operating versus VAT state in the state from where you are sourcing the goods, you may have a potential to optimize the tax in that context if that VAT rate happens to be lower than the VAT rate where effectively you are operating. Because Form C provides that the supplying goods or supplying state rate VAT will apply in relation to supply of interstate goods without Form C. That's a small portion of arbitrage, while all the states have aligned their rates on the VAT, but there is still exists some small difference in terms of the rate of VAT. So this is very important amendment in the context of central sales tax, which has been proposed in this budget. One interesting point, of course, this is proposed to be to be notified. It has to become act, and hopefully it is a prospective, but it is last 3 years of benefit may be secured, but eventually that is still you'll have to complete the Form C and other formalities. Moving on to other section
Yeah, Rohit
of,
Vikram Bhai is joined in, so maybe if you want to take his comments.
yeah, so Vikram bhai, I think you have appeared in some of the matters on these issues of central sales tax and a Form C, where has been specific amendment now made on a petroleum products. Just a question to you: do you see it is still susceptible to any challenge now, this proposed amendment, because of the way now the benefit is now restricted to only petroleum industry?
Yeah, I haven't seen the fine print, but from what I can understand, is that there is not a substantial amendment in the main section 8.3 itself to wipe out the basis or the foundation of the Punjab and Haryana judgment, which was confirmed by the Supreme Court. Uh, Having said that, this amendment is really salt over injury. Instead of widening the net of the GST by bringing in fuel so that the cost of transaction can come down, this in fact has put its back. I hope that the government will look at it again, because the cost of transaction is an important part, and this will increase the cost of the transaction. So it's a double whammy in that sense.
Thank you, sir. I think we have been covering some first session that we had in the all the clauses in relation to the investments and investments, attracting investments in manufacturing in India. Now, the second position that we are getting into the exemptions, deductions, and some of the other substantive changes which have been proposed in the budget. The first and the foremost is the scope of the equalization levy, which got clarified. We had a lot of issues, particularly from the last year, where the equalization levy scope has been widened. We had a lot of challenges initially when, of course, it was restricted to the online advertisement. 2020 onwards, the scope has been widened significantly. And there was a discussion, can the equalization levy can be implemented through the Finance Act? Is it again a susceptible to constitutional challenge, which is what globally known the Google levy? All of these have been effectively now become law of the land. It has been going on, but the bold step has been taken in 2020, where the significant amendments have made and the scope has been widened, in which case there have been a lot of uh, too important in terms of the scope of this equalization levy, and there have been some amendment which have been made or proposed to remove certain anomaly. So Nishan, would you want to quickly take us through, and then we need to get into some of the dispute related provisions because Vikram Bhai, I think, has some matter again coming up in the court.
Yeah, Rohit. So yeah, like Rohit mentioned that, another important levy introduced by, and in fact, this is a levy which has become sort of, I would say, globally renowned, because there is a controversy where even the other nations have been questioning the eligibility of such a levy. The important amendments that have been brought about this year are pronounced in the budget are one, to very clearly clarify this aspect that any source, any income or any revenue which can be classified in the nature of a royalty or an FTS will be excluded from the scope of equalization levy. Now, let me just explain the implication of this. Any royalty or FTS paid to a non-resident would otherwise could have been subject to withholding tax, which could have ranged even to the tune of about 10%. As compared to that, an equalization levy is at a lesser rate of tax which is applicable. So therefore, in fact, there was an inclination by companies to structure it such that if a royalty or FTS is subject to equalization levy, it was more beneficial than it being classified as a royalty or FTS. But with this clarification being brought about, very clearly it has been identified that it will now be either very clearly that if it is a royalty or FTS, it does not fall within the scope of the equalization levy, and therefore the equalization levy provisions do not apply. The provision has also been, there was also one more controversy related to that, is that if it was a royalty or FTS, there was generally a dual implication which was coming about of a TDS as well as the equalization levy for the period between April 2020 to 21, because this clarification has been brought out later on. So they have brought in a retrospective one to say that this dual implication has also been clarified. The widening aspect again is very important because the equalization levy has now brought in implications in relation to what is online sale of goods and online provision of services. And it has been made wider enough, while in the garb of clarifying, they have very specifically said that if any of the activities, any or one or more of the following activities are online activities in the nature of acceptance of offer for sale, purchase order, or placing of the purchase order, or payment of consideration, supply of goods, or provision of services, partly or wholly, anything done online. Now it's a big matter of question that as to what is online activities. The terminology online activities has not been defined in the act, but it is likely that one or more of these activities could be considered as online, and if it is online, it will be subject to equalization levy. There has been a clarification also which has been provided, an explanation sort of, that the consideration received or receivable from the e-commerce supply or services shall include consideration for sale of goods, irrespective of whether the e-commerce operator owns the goods or not. That means even if he is just a platform, even then marketplace platform will also be an e-commerce operator, and the consideration of provision of services irrespective of whether the service is provided or facilitated by the e-commerce operator. Very clearly, while one aspect has gone to clarify the anomaly regarding the availability of exemption vis-a-vis the royalty as well as the TDS has been clarified, but more importantly, by bringing in this, it has in a way very clearly clarified the scope, but rather expanded the scope. There are a lot of other issues which remain unaddressed. For example, there are issues of the IP address of the person placing the order, etc., which still remain open and remain unaddressed. It's just a matter of wait and watch if these get clarified in a matter of time. Yeah, Rohit.
Absolutely, Nishant. I think important is the scope of these online activities. A simple, now we have all the industries which are global industries having operations is multi-jurisdictional, where they use a common ERP or the IT system to place an order or to receive invoices, so on and so forth. Will it be still considered as online activity, even though physically you are importing the goods, delivering the goods, making the payment, because you are including the common ERP? Will it be considered as an online and will be exposed to the equalization levy? While the issue still remain unclear and matter of interpretation, one can really say this is not as contemplated as online sale of goods or online provision of service, because that is not what is contemplated for the purpose of equalization levy. One of the question which has been come, while we'll take the question answer at the last, that if the FTS is not applicable on account of make available clause under the treaty and it still qualifies being an FTS under the act, will the benefit be available? Appears to be yes. Section 1050 will be still available and you may not be required to pay either of the tax on that sort of a transaction. But we'll have to see the fine print and a final enacted position once this goes through a final enactment purposes. But it appears as we speak that it may not be applicable in those sort of cases. Moving on to the next slide, in terms of other substantive provisions under the DTR, deductions not available if the contribution towards employees provident fund or a superannuation fund is not paid within the due dates prescribed under the respective legislation. This is a very important amendment because there are certain industries who are facing the cash crunch while they are deducting as an employee contribution as a CTC, but not effectively paying this amount at this point in time. Eventually, they will make the payment and would have claimed deduction under section 43B at that point in time, and they would have been available to them as a deduction even though they have made the delayed payment. This was also held by Supreme Court in Vinay Cement case, but now this particular aspect has been clearly overturned. There has been specific provision that the deduction will be available to the industries only if they make this employee contribution within the due date. If it is delayed, then the benefit won't be available as such in relation to this particular aspect. And very, very important provision. This is in interest of the employees. The rationale given beyond this is that because if the companies are not making payment on a timely basis, the delayed payment is not getting the benefit that employees would have otherwise got, like an interest and other benefits, which is not been available. Therefore, they want to make some stringent provisions wherein you'll have to make this contribution payment on time. Another important proposal is the term liable to tax proposed to be defined to mean that there is a liability of tax on a person under any law in any country and includes cases where exemptions are granted subsequent to imposition of such tax. Very important, again, amendment, because most of the treaty use the term liable to tax, or under, in that sense, if the respective jurisdiction provides for any exemption, interpretation has been taken that it was not liable to tax or the benefit under the treaty was not available, and under the domestic tax law you were required to end up paying higher taxes. However, now that has been clarified, very welcome move, that liable to tax would mean that even if the exemptions have been granted subsequently, but originally the tax has been imposed, that would be considered as liable to tax. Having said that, we believe that the amendment proposed is still in a restrictive way. There are certain cases right from the upfront itself, there could be no tax position particularly which may come up. And what will happen in those sort of cases where I don't get the TRCs in those jurisdictions, because in the first place itself, I am not liable to pay tax at all. Not that I am liable and exemption has been granted. What will happen to those sort of a cases appears to not to be entitled for the treaty benefit, and we'll have to really look at that. Another important amendment is the presumptive taxations for LLP, particularly from the professional side, that it was initially again an interpretational issue. The firm would have included the LLP, so the LLPs who are having the turnover of below certain value of 50 lakhs, you could have gone under the presumptive tax. But now, if you are an LLP, you cannot take a benefit of presumptive tax. The purpose of that has been considered that under the LLP Act, you still need to make the accounts. This was effectively to dispense the requirement of preparation of accounts and getting this audited and whatnot. But an LLP Act, for the compliance of that, you make an account, then why do you really need a presumptive taxation? That was the rationale given, and therefore this is no more a benefit which is available to us. Another interesting...
On the last one, the deduction of disallowance of employee deduction, the question is whether there is it prospective or retrospective? The answer, it will be prospective. Somebody just raised the question, yeah. Please.
Perfect. Okay. Now comes to the another important amendments in terms of the proposal. We have a safe harbor limit increase from 10 to 20% in case of a sale of a flat by the developer, which is like a first time allotment of any person. This was announced as part of the COVID packages in November 12, and therefore now this has made it effective. But interestingly, there has been extension up to June 30th, 2021, which has been provided that they would accept this 20% of a gap, whether even if you are selling the property below the 20%, that would be considered as not an additional consideration for the purpose of 43 CA or section 56(2)(10) under the Income Tax Act. So this is very important amendment. This is good for the real estate developers, which will help them to really liquidate their inventory, while some of the states have reduced the stamp duty and they have already benefited of these provisions. Hopefully this will further strengthen their position of carrying on the business. Another important amendment is in terms of withholding tax at 0.1 on payment made by buyer. This was again last year where the provisions has been introduced for about 10 crore rupees of a business. If you are buying the goods worth of 50 lakhs or more, you are required to apply the provisions of TCS. Now that has been dispensed with, you have got into the TDS as well, not dispensed with. Now you are also have additional provisions of TDS, and now you'll have to, either of that you'll have to really apply for, while we believe most of the cases it will go for a TDS as opposed to TCS, which was becoming difficult because TCS is that you are collecting from the buyer 0.1% and it is a credit to the buyer, whereas actually this should have been the TDS provision, which has made it right now. Then we have a higher rate of TDS, TCS applicable for specified persons not filing return of income. The specified person is defined to mean, again, an interesting provision that a person who has not filed return for last 2 years will not be entitled to get a lower rate of TDS as applicable. In fact, under 206AA, the rate of tax goes double. So if normally the TDS applicable is say 10%, you will end up paying 20% now TDS if you have not filed the return for last 2 years. Very important provision in that sense. Ideally, why is not filing return? Because he may not be taxable, but now you end up collecting more tax at 20%. Definitely may not justify it, but this is what is applicable for specified persons, and we'll have to look at the specified person being who has not filed in preceding 2 assessment years the tax returns, and withholding taxes INR 50,000 or more in these 2 years. There are certain certain procedural provisions which have been made, extension of certain benefits deductions which have been done, which I'm sure you would have gone through this. Let's get to the very important provision, and that's where we all need to really look at it, this from the indirect tax perspective. This is a very substantial provision. We all know that we have a section 16 under the GST law, which grants the credit with a certain conditionalities. Now, one of the condition in that now been introduced is from the date to be notified, and therefore hopefully this is only applicable prospective, not a retrospective, wherein ITC on invoice stroke debit note may be availed only when its details have been furnished by the supplier in GSTR 1. Now we have various conditions under 16.2. One first 16.2A, that you have a tax invoice available. 16.2AA now is that ITC on invoice debit note may be availed only when its details have been furnished by the supplier in GSTR 1. That means your supplier is required to file the return, and then only there is a provision that you can take a credit. Now, the real question here to be looked at it is, GST has initially introduced, what is the background of this provision? Is that there was no requirement of this nature because robust matching mechanism has been proposed, but that has not been effectuated. Then we have section 43A, which got enacted to implement a similar mechanism, but that also was not been effectuated. Then restrictions, however, were incorporated via proviso to Rule 36, where the restrictions have been provided for mismatched transaction. Initially started with you can take up to 20%, then reduced to 10%. Currently, it was 5%. So what was happening is that even if as long as you had a valid invoice for availing the credit, you could have taken a credit even though supplier has not filed the return up to certain percentages. Initially 20, then gone down to 5%. And this restriction was being brought in through the rules and not in the section. First time, they have amended the section itself and they have made it conditional that the supplier is also required to file the return. Now, there are certain impact points, and then I will open up for the panel discussion. The first one is this a susceptible to legal challenge? Because we have a judgment of Arise India, Delhi High Court, which says for the fault of a supplier, the recipient should not be really suffering, because I have taken an invoice, I have paid that tax, how can you deny me the credit? And the second, and which is the foremost important discussion, is that do I need to comply with this new condition at the time of availing credit or before the assessment? Now, if you read section 16, there are various conditions which are prescribed. That tax has to be deposited, tax has to be paid, you will have to have an invoice. Then, do I need to comply with this condition before availing credit or in the course of assessment? One interpretation, which looks like a logical interpretation, is that I can avail the credit upfront, but the compliance qua this condition can be done in the course of assessment. Eventually, if your supplier does not file the return, then the credit will be denied. But at the outset, when I receive the invoice, I can take a credit, because otherwise one of the conditions is tax has been paid. Now, let's look at it practically. I am buying something in Feb. Actual tax will be paid by the supplier in March. How can I take a credit in February then? Therefore, section 16 appears to provide for a post facto satisfying the conditions as opposed to upfront satisfying it. And that is what looks like an intent, but this will again pose a lot of litigation. Then whether this has to be read in harmoniously with Rule 36.4 or it has to be independent of that, because Rule 36.4 is not been amended. That condition of 5% still exists, and therefore do we really need to look at it harmoniously, and then I can take a credit in the course of assessment. We can really justify this credit being rightly taken and supplier has filed the return. And the last one, that therefore, to avoid any disputes, we believe that businesses really need to implement the real-time reconciliation and revised payment terms so that there is no loss of a credit or loss of an amount when it comes to particularly this mismatch or supplier has not been filing the return. Now I would request Vikram Bhai to provide his comments on this particular issue, because this has posed a lot of issues for all the industry post yesterday's budget announcement.
Apologies to all. I'm popping in and out like a jack in the box, but those are the perils of a virtual world. I agree with Rohit broadly that this is something which is going to be an irritant, at least to an honest taxpayer who has paid the tax to the vendor, received a taxable invoice, but for completely extraneous reasons, if this is not uploaded by the supplier, then in that situation, the recipient can't really avail, and this is an additional fetter which has been introduced in section 16.2. But let's understand this on a balance. It's quite obvious that this condition has been inserted because there have been a lot of cases which have come to the government's attention where certain credits have been taken which are otherwise not eligible or permissible under law. And we know those kind of cases, especially when popular expressions like circular trading or what the government carries to the gallery in the form of fake invoices and all of those situations. The real issue which the courts will grapple with is that while somebody has a vested right to take the credit, is the government debarred from regulating the credit? And would the power to regulate really be equated with the power of denying the credit once the recipient of the supply has paid the tax to the vendor, to the supplier, and has got a document which is otherwise a valid document in law? And there could be multiple reasons, because in a given situation, the supplier, because of contractual disputes, other commercial considerations, may not think it's appropriate to put this as part of his returns. And in that scenario, what will happen to the person who has paid the amount to the supplier? So this is going to be a serious discussion, and I think the courts will be re-engaged. At least from an equity perspective, it seems that if all the other factors are equal, then the recipient of the supply who has paid the tax, has got a taxable amount, would be able to argue pretty successfully that this kind of a procedural non-compliance of Section 37, 30, and Section 39 should not come in the way of what is otherwise an equitable right of the recipient.
Particularly, sir, where there have been specific recovery provisions available for the department to recover non-payment of tax by the supplier. There have been provisions with when you collect the tax but not pay, you can actually seize the assets of the supplier, and all other provisions exist. How can the buyer or a recipient be punished in non-action of the department on such recovery of tax, and buyer is being punished?
Absolutely. And also, Rohit, we have to bear in mind that today, the matching mechanism, which was proclaimed to be the heart of the entire credit mechanism under the GST fabric, and if there is any defect in that, the SSC can't be blamed for it. So there is really there is a lot to be said in favor of the recipient. And I think, but for the moment, in the short run at least, there is going to be a lot of heartburn as far as the SSC is concerned.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you. Let's moving on to some of the next provisions on amendments.
Could I make a comment there?
Yes, Mr. Singh, you can make
Hello.
a comment. Yes.
Actually, once Mr. Nankani speaks on a topic, one should be keeping shut. But I thought, in most of various courts, the point which has been missed is that the credit which is being allowed is that of tax. The credit is not of the amount which represented tax to be paid by the supplier. And therefore, unless the tax is paid, though there is no inherent right of taking the credit by anybody. And that point is glossed over or is not appreciated. So by this provision, what is being ensured is that the credit of tax is taken, and tax is a tax when it is paid to the government. When I pay an amount, the recipient pays an amount equal to tax to the supplier, it is not actually tax. It's an amount equal to tax which the supplier has to be paying to the government. And therefore, I think if it is properly argued, this will sustain on a concept basis, not on the basis of equity, not on the basis of procedure, but on the basis of very concept that, look, unless there is a tax, and tax is tax when it is paid to the government, the question of taking credit should not arise. So I think it has a lot of strength to sustain itself in the face of challenge. Thanks.
Yeah, so we can look at it, and this is something similar provision existed under Delhi VAT when the Arise India judgment has come up. Specifically, Delhi High Court has thumpingly held that effectively that cannot be a provision which debars the credit in those sort of cases. Moving on to the next amendment, which is section 16(3), proposed to be substituted, whereby option of export on payment of IGST now shall be available only to notified class of person. And this something is again a very, very important amendment. Now, if you look at it, export of goods under a rebate under IGST has always been in the wake of changing environment. Initially, there was rebate available, no advance license benefit available. 17 October, the benefit has been given for advance license, rebate was also available. February 18, the benefit has been withdrawn on rebate. October 18, it has been made retrospectively. October 18 onwards, again the benefit has been available, but if the supplier has not claimed, initially supplier has not claimed, now you have not claimed the benefit. So in all, the rebate under the GST law has been constant change. And this is another big change which has now been proposed, that the rebate of GST for exporter will be available only to notified class of person or notified supplier of services. Very, very deterring provision, because let's look at it from this perspective in relation to this provision not being there. Now, the only option available for the exporter is to claim the refund of an accumulated credit. Now, if the benefit of a refund of an accumulated credit is the only option left, assuming I am not one of the notified supplier of goods or services or a class of persons, then I have two problems. One, I need to timely file the refund claims, because in a rebate, whenever I make a supply, I could pay utilizing the past credit also. Whereas in refund of accumulated credit, it has to be timely manner every quarter, every half year. And for that period, once you file a refund claim, that's it. If you miss the filing, you can't claim that refund forever thereafter. That's a point number one. The point number two is that the refund is available only of inputs and input services, not of capital goods. So I am an exporter who is 80-90% goods are exported. I buy a lot of capital goods to manufacture my goods, where what will I do of the credit which is accumulated on account of capital goods? That money is stuck. I am an exporter. You should be supporting an exporter. But whereas the option of rebate, which was otherwise available, has now been withdrawn, and I will be forced only to go on the basis of refund of inputs and input services. And what will I do with this capital goods credit? Third, which is the most important one, that if I claim a refund, there has been new proviso which got added, that I also need to receive the payment within the guidelines as prescribed under the FEMA. Now, we had a last year provision where effectively if I export the goods prior to 2020, it was an export, irrespective whether I receive payment in time or beyond time. Last year, they have amended the rules, Rule 96B, introduced the provision that you'll have to receive within the guidelines of FEMA. Now again, there was a challenge that how can the condition which was not existed under the act itself, you can introduce to the rules. To overcome that sort of a challenge, now the condition has been prescribed under the act itself that even for export of goods, you'll have to receive the payment within the prescribed timelines under the FEMA. A lot of investigation disputes are going on as we speak today on account of this rebate being claimed and advance authorization on EOU benefits have been claimed. Very, very deterrent. Again, another provision. There have been a lot of procedural issues which will come up. The timing wise, the capital goods credit, the receipt of consideration within the time from the export will be an important factors to be looked at it, looking at this particular amendments on the proposed this thing. Another interesting amendment on this mutuality, wherein we had a judgment of Kolkata Club and others under the VAT law, which has been held specifically that you can't be providing services to yourselves, particularly in the context of club or societies where members and societies have not been considered a distinct person. And many of the SSCs have started taking a benefit even under the GST for the purpose of this sort of a provision. However, this judgment, but now there have been retrospective amendment which has been made or proposed, where the concept of mutuality will not be available, even though there has been some judgment which existed at the Supreme Court. So it is retrospective effect. Right from July 17 under the GST law, the benefit of mutuality won't be available. If somebody would have been followed the judgment of Supreme Court for last 3 years, and going forward, once this gets notified, how will I reverse the provision and pay the tax for the past period for the interstate transactions between the clubs and the members and the societies? And all of these are very important things to be looked at. So Vikram, you want to add on this particular provision, because this is clearly again overturning the judgment of Supreme Court, that too retrospectively.
Sure. Let me start first by paying my respects to Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh's words are always weighty and they're always respected. So I always welcome them and I look up to Mr. Singh for his valuable comments. Now, coming to this subject of Calcutta Club. In fairness, this judgment deals with the position prior to GST. It does not deal with the GST provision at all. Having said, this entire doctrine of mutuality is not based on any legal provision or a statutory provision, be it the Income Tax Act or the VAT, erstwhile VAT laws, or for that matter, now the service tax as the law existed prior to GST. This is essentially based on a principle of agency, and that is well brought out in the Calcutta Club judgment, where they trace the origin of this particular doctrine to Graff versus Evans. So the point here is that if today there is a statutory provision which artificially or by a deeming fiction seeks to distinguish between two persons who are otherwise there for a common purpose and based on the principle of agency or mutuality are not seem to be doing business with each other, the question is, does such a legal fiction or artificial provision create or destroy, create a taxable event or destroy the principle of mutuality? Mind you, in Calcutta Club, there is one passage in which the Supreme Court has said that the legal form is irrelevant. It may take the form of a company under the Companies Act. It may take the form of a society under the Societies Registration Act. It could even be a trust, because Calcutta Club relies on the judgment in YMCA. And one of the entities in YMCA was a trust. The YMCA itself was a trust. Now, given this principle which has been laid down by the Supreme Court, that the legal framework or the legal structure does not matter, and even if it is a company incorporated under the Companies Act, yet the doctrine of mutuality would be applicable. Given this principle now, can this definition really change the course of the law is a point to be considered. Having said that, again, the doctrine of mutuality is getting narrower by the day. After the Calcutta Club judgment, I'm sure you would have noticed that under Income Tax Act, the Supreme Court in Yum restaurants has taken a very different view, and in fact tightened the test laid down in Calcutta Club. Again, it has not referred to Calcutta Club, so it will give rise to another legal debate as to the precedentiary value of Yum restaurants, which does not take into consideration a larger bench decision in Calcutta Club. So again, we are going to have one more round of litigation, it seems, on this. Finally, the dust has not settled as yet.
Thank you, sir.
Rohit,
So-
if I may just add on the previous slide. So we started the presentation, talking about the budget, and we mentioned that, it's a good budget and an encouraging budget, no additional tax burden, a welcoming budget, because giving a more stable and consistent flow, that there is a consistency in the tax provisions, also leading to ease of doing. I think the Honorable Finance Minister could have done effective by also not bringing in the retrospective provisions. I think in this budget, there are a few retrospective provisions, and I think that could have been avoided. Just referring to the previous slide which you had mentioned, having a retrospective, and you very clearly mentioned that if somebody has already taken a position, what do they do for the past period?
That's right. Okay, so
Rohit,
moving on to the.
no, one second. Let me butt in here. Mr. Nankani's kind words are so heartening, and we are mutual admirers anyway. I'll add one more point, that Supreme Court in large number of cases has very heavily frowned upon this tendency of overturning their judgments by retrospective amendment. And if there are enough stakes and somebody can afford, a senior advocate like Mr. Nankani, he'll be able to get it invalidated as unconstitutional, I would think, because what they are doing by this retrospective amendment is they're overturning the judgment of the Supreme Court, and that's the only purpose. Whether they can do it prospectively, I'll go along with Mr. Nankani that even prospective possibility is fraught with risk, and the courts can take a view that when at the normative level, service to oneself cannot be taxed, then any deeming fiction cannot undo it. But that could be debated. But the retrospective amendment can definitely be thrown out if it is challenged.
That's right.
And actually, that's what I meant when I said that the amendments to the indirect taxation are more intolerant, more punitive, and less state-friendly. And these are the examples. Go ahead,
Absolutely.
please.
Okay, so we have a few slides and then get into the topic of which is close to all of us being lawyers and dispute resolution issues. So let's quickly turn few slides on this agri development cess, which is effectively reduced BCD and higher AIDC. This is merely for the purpose of allocation. Another important amendment on the customs duty exemptions, which is now had a validity period of 2 years, if not amended or looked at it, validated beyond. Another important thing here is that there have been cases where old exemption notification, which will also be revived and will be looked at it, and if already not required, can be omitted. Let's get to the core topic now for the discussions today also is the dispute resolution mechanism. There are few major amendments which have happened in direct tax and interesting amendments in the indirect tax one.
But
Let's
Rohit,
start.
is it not your concern? Rohit, is it not your concern that the agri cess does not seem to be, eligible for credit?
Sir, it was basic customs duty, and therefore, anyway, BCD was also not eligible for the credit at that point.
Look at the thing imposed on the excise side, for example.
Right.
And it is not basic custom. Basic custom duty is only section 12 of customs act. This is a separate duty. But anyway,
this was basic customs duty. I was talking on a cess which is imposed on the import side of it.
Okay.
An excise duty, what has been imposed now, as also most of the cases not available as a credit except for the petroleum industry or products.
No, I'm talking about within petroleum sector.
Within petroleum sector
also,
that may issue also come up for the cess being not available as a credit in some instances. That's right. Let's focus on some of the important amendments in the Tax Settlement Commission. Income tax has been discontinued. There will be an interim board which will be set up for pending application up to February 1st, 2021. And the most interesting amendment is that now advance ruling, which was effectively non-functional for want of chairman or vice chairman, which is supposed to be a Supreme Court judge, ex-retired Supreme Court judge, it was not functional. Now that has been replaced with the board of advance ruling, and the board of advance ruling will be constituted by the commissioner, chief commissioners, 2 members at a chief commissioner level. And if the order of the advance ruling is not binding on the department, if you agree, you can file an appeal directly to the High Court. And there has been introduction of faceless proceedings before the ITAD. The foremost, why is the advance ruling sought? The advance ruling is sought to achieve a certainty, particularly by non-residents in the income tax. And we have seen what happened in the GST advance ruling when it is left to the commissioner or a joint commissioner level person, where invariably 80, 90 cases out of 100 cases will be a negative ruling. By nature, as I would say, that they may not be willing to look at it, the cases in a very different perspective on a holistic manner. What we are having now, we are having an advance ruling, board of advance rulings, wherein now we will have a chief commissioner deciding the matter for a non-resident, which they are looking at having a certainty on a topic. And then you will have to end up going to the Supreme Court or High Court and Supreme Court. Is it really been desirable? Or we would have had a better approach of advance ruling where we could have formed certain other ex-judicial person as opposed to having a person of a commissionerate level, and then still would have been functioning as an advance ruling. And secondly, more importantly, we were having difficulties in faceless assessments and a first appeal. Now we are really having a faceless proceeding before ITAD. Lot of questions have been posed whether this will be sustainable. Are we ready for that? Are we really looking at compliance of a natural justice? All of these issues are likely to come up. I would now request Vikram Bhai to give his comments on both these important amendments on a dispute mechanism, where the formation of a board of advance ruling and the secondly is the faceless ITAD.
Rohit, I just can't understand why on earth would these measures be introduced. To my mind, they are certainly not revolutionary. In fact, they are 2 steps back. The budget, for all other reasons, is a good budget, laudable budget. But somewhere you silently tuck away such retrograde steps. I think I would not be doing any disservice if on a public platform like this, I may just take a very broad view in saying that there was a time where the government encouraged tribunalization. Today, we are seeing across the board, even under other statutes, other regulators, be it the National Green Tribunal or the electricity commissions, which are there is a certain degree of apathy towards tribunalization. And I think this is one such step towards the same direction. You had a settlement commission which was doing a reasonably good job. And it was, in a sense, a kind of a permanent body dealing with your amnesty kind of situations where people who did not want to risk prosecution and wanted to claim immunity would go to the settlement commission. Something which had been doing its job fairly well, you suddenly, in the midst of its good work, try to disband it and replace it with what? Not a superior body. You're not replacing it with a more robust body. You are, in fact, reducing the efficacy, notwithstanding the judgment of the Supreme Court in Madras Bar Association. The Supreme Court was very, very clear in Madras Bar that once you give judicial functions or even quasi-judicial functions or adjudicatory functions to a body, please make sure that it is represented by judicially trained personnel. Now, as you rightly pointed out, that this interim board, and then similarly in the case of advance ruling, which has been a complete failure in the GST, it's all about inspiring confidence. it's all about bringing in trust and faith into the system. That can I go to somebody with an open mind who will give me a dispassionate and an objective ruling before I start my business? And if that mechanism fails, you're starting the very relationship on a weak note. And this is precisely what I think has missed the mind of the finance minister when she has not paid adequate attention to these two very important parts of the dispute resolution regime, which is in our system. The last one, the faceless ITAT. Again, I understand that there is a lot of enthusiasm about digital promotion, about the virtual hearings, and to some extent, I must say that the virtual hearings, did keep the systems working and in progress in times like this pandemic, where we were almost confined to our homes and offices and did not have the freedom to move out. It did, but everything has its own time and place, and everything beyond a particular thing cannot really deliver its desired results. I'm reminded of something which the Supreme Court very recently said in a case of Rojar Matthew versus the South Indian Bank. That, and I quote from the Supreme Court judgment, saying that open hearings are essential to build the trust and confidence of the public and the community at large in judicial institutions. Faceless proceedings may be relevant to a point, but when it comes to ITAT, which is the final fact-finding authority, to say that this would be in a virtual form or, as the name suggests, faceless, really belies the age-old proposition that justice should not only be done, but seen to be done. And I intend the pun, seen to be done. To my mind, it's a very futuristic thought, but a bit too premature. Close on the heels, I think coincidentally on the same day, 1st of February 2021, and I must share this with all our listeners here, is that on the same day, a few kilometers away from where the finance minister was delivering her speech, in the Supreme Court, there was a meeting of Bar Council of India with the Chief Justice of India. And it was Bar Council of India which very vocally said, we want open court hearings because that is what builds confidence. That's what brings out the best amongst the legal fraternity. And there is no substitute for open court hearings. And the Chief Justice has relented, and the Bar Council of India has issued a letter. And if what is expected, that from 1st of March, we would be having physical hearing in the Supreme Court. That it's not about reopening of courts, but it is a case of saying that how important it is to have physical hearings. And this was just to contrast the two extreme stands which seem to be emerging, one from the Parliament House, the other from the Supreme Court's corridors. And somewhere I'm sure, they will have to be reconciled.
Absolutely, sir. And Mr. Singh, your specific comments on faceless tribunal being an ex-member of a tribunal.
Vikram Bhai rightly put it. A physical hearing has something which a faceless hearing will never be able to achieve. So as Vikram Bhai said, some compromise has to be reached. I think the compromise is very obvious that anybody who wants a physical hearing will have to be given a physical hearing. But if somebody says, okay, I can do with virtual hearing, that person may be allowed to opt for it. But there is no substitute as of now for physical hearing, at least at the level of tribunal. As a matter of fact, this word faceless seems to have caught on for no rhyme or reason. Even in the customs, looking at income tax, we started doing faceless assessment now, which apparently is not going anywhere at all. So this faceless is actually not a very workable solution in all situations, particularly in judicial proceedings before the tribunal. So that I think will have to be argued against before the government to allow physical hearing for those who want it.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. I think some of the quick provisions, and then we'll take up the question and answer.
Just one point on this faceless proceeding. while I completely appreciate what Vikram Bhai and Mr. Singh has also mentioned, but if you see the government's whole approach, it has gone into the faceless assessment. And I appreciate your point also. You're saying that, even the faceless penalty and appeals has not yet taken proper grips, and they've gone into a faceless ITAD. But is there not somewhere a resounding that going into a faceless or faceless proceeding being conducted results into a reduction in the direct interaction? Now, we understand this is a judiciary, whereas that is with the departmental authority, and therefore the implication. So the point is, is that, this is where the government is looking at, and whether we encourage and or we go retrograde on the other provisions as well.
Absolutely. I think, Nishant, you made a fair point where can we have a faceless with judiciary versus faceless with the departmental officers?
Actually, Rohit, if you look at the provision more carefully, the finance minister is not proposing a completely faceless ITAT.
Yeah, that's right. They are giving us the hearing if you want
just
to
an
have.
option is being given to those who want to have it faceless.
Right, that's right. Now coming to the other few slides, and then there are a few questions which are already raised. One is the reopening of assessments. We've read that now the period has been reduced from 6 years to 3 years. Very important amendment, because the assessees are looking at a certainty on a topic. It cannot be a never-ending story that even after assessment there are 6 years left. But another important thing that the 10 years period continued, subject to, of course, taking an approval from principal commissioner if the amount exceeds 5 million. And as long as it has the issues of intention to evade tax and escaping assessment. Now, we know that typically in this sort of a cases, the allegations are always taken that you had an intention to evade. Nobody says that there was no intention, but that's also the 10 years provisions continued. Another customs interesting provisions got introduced where you'll have to issue a show cause notice within the period of 2 years from the start of an investigation. Now we have that cases where investigation continue for a number of months and years where there has been no culmination of a show cause notice. The statutory period of 1 year and 5 years or 2 years and normal limitation period continued. However, one more additional restrictions have been imposed where you'll have to issue a show cause notice within the period of 2 years from the date of investigation. Now, the question which has come up here, what would be considered at a start of an investigation? Merely sending a notice is an investigation, or they when identify a particular issue that would be considered as start of an investigation? And how do we really look at it in this sort of a provisions? So, Mr. Singh, if you want to add a few comments, otherwise we'll have to take some questions and let to get into the.
As a matter of fact, I was going to say that although it looks very attractive that they have put a ceiling of 2 years for investigation, if you look at the provision and the way it's worded, it is so clumsy that it is impossible to make out as to from which particular date you will reckon 2 years. For example, it says several words. Initiation of audit, search, seizure, summons, as the case may be. Now, in an investigation, all these things could be present and nobody would know. And more importantly, nobody can argue that there can be only one set of investigation going on against a particular company, and which particular summons would result into which kind of show cause notice and at what point of time. So it will be impossible, number one, to identify from these wordings, identify the exact date from which it could be reckoned. I would suggest that the provision in the GST law, which puts a bar on the period during which the entire proceedings up to adjudication have to be completed, that's a far better provision for the trade than this mere ceiling on the period of investigation, particularly when it is so clumsily worded at the moment.
That's right. Absolutely. The last provision on the dispute is the customs, and very interesting one. And this is where what has been provided that if you have taken a credit based on certain fake or bogus invoices, you have exported the goods, you have tried to claim a refund. Now under the Customs Act, there is a potential penalty which could be imposed equivalent to 5 times of the ITC or the refund that you have effectively claimed. How can there be a penalty under the Customs Act when I'm exporting the goods by taking a invoices, assumingly the fake invoices and taking a credit, there is an additional penalty which is now been imposed under the Customs Act, which is equivalent to the 5 times of such ITC or a refund that you have claimed. Very interesting provision which has no correlation of ITC under the Customs Act, and there are already a lot of penalty and other things exist under the GST law. So this is just one more deterrent that if somebody wants to go through the fake invoices and taking credit and manipulate the system, there may be potential additional penalty which may be imposed.
But
Mr. Singh,
Rohit, again here again, look at the wording, and the wordings are important and clumsy again. It says if you take a fake invoice on the basis of which you utilize the credit. Now, on the basis of a fake invoice, you can take the credit. You cannot utilize the credit on the basis of a fake invoice. So the wording itself is clumsy, number one.
That's
Number
right.
two, if the wording is properly set, then imposing penalty in the Customs Act may not be a huge issue, because in these provisions, the customs authority is actually sanctioning refund in some cases. So there's
is
a
right.
bit of a link there,
There
but the
is
wording
link,
has
but-
to be improved.
Yeah, so I think last is there are some digitalization of tax compliances which have happened. And this is all we have gone through in terms of the electronic filing portals. You'll have to file bill of entry in 1 day advance. And this is all other stuff which have happened. Now, before I conclude and take up the question and answer session, Vikram bhai, your final words on the budget and some of the proposals.
Address the growth push to investments and not.
I think the budget really has been
The initial part of as many
overall
budgets was being,
addressing
labeled
certain
as
other
by
macro
the
level
analysts
issues,
and earlier on by
especially
the Prime
arising
Minister.
out of the pandemic that we had. And I think its effort was to bring in impetus as far as creation of demand, having more infrastructure projects, government pumping in money. All of that at the macro level sounds very good. But when it comes to tax proposals, and especially some of the indirect tax proposals, I think there seems to be some degree of not broad-mindedness, and and one understands the government's compulsions, because this year itself, the states were not fully compensated. The central government had to borrow and give funds down the line. But looking at the last 2 months collections, which they are very proudly flaunting it, that we collected 1,15,000 crores in December and 1,20,000 record collection in the last month, January. I think looking at the manner in which the GST collections themselves have risen and gone up, there should be a little more attention being paid to the broader parts of the tax structure. Yes, certain other measures are welcome, like the Security Markets Code, which they are going to consolidate. As I said, overall, I think it's a good budget. And I think in matter of time, the other aspects, the nuts and bolts, can be fixed as and when the problem does arise.
Perfect, sir. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Your last few comments on budget, and then I
Two
request
points,
Nishant.
Rohit, which you did not notice. One is section 50, the provision of interest. It says that the interest will be payable on the amount paid in cash, and but in case there are proceedings under section 73 or 74, then the interest will be payable on the entire amount. To my mind, the payment of interest for the purpose of delaying the funds to the government. So the principle should not change merely because there is a proceeding under section 73 or 74. And the interest should continue to be payable only on the net amount paid in cash. And that, I think, needs to be taken up for representation before the government. Second point about section 152, if you look carefully, it says the information collected shall not be used without granting a personal hearing. Now, that is neither here nor there. So I collect the information, I give a personal hearing. Whatever you say, I can use the information for proceedings. The basic purpose is granting of hearing means that after hearing, I'll have to come to a finding whether, in spite of your objection, I can use it in the proceedings. And if I give a finding, that should be subject to appeal. So section 152 is a truncated section. It does not deal with the situation in its entirety. because merely
That's right.
granting a
So,
hearing and then
Mr.
using
Singh-
the information is of no consequence. Yeah.
Absolutely, sir. Mr. Singh, in terms of your observation on section 50, there is at least an important that if you file the return after the proceeding initiated under 73-74, if I had already filed the returns, but there has been dispute in terms of the interpretation of the position which I have taken in return, can I still take a benefit of net cash liability and pay interest on that? That is still an interpretation that one needs to really take. Furnishing of the return after 73-74, but if I have filed the return already, can I still take a benefit of net cash liability as an interest? That's an important
That you
point.
can.
Yeah, so
That
then
you
there is
can. I'm
absolutely,
talking about. Yeah.
then that's okay. Then that's those who are defaulters and not filing returns, they may want to punish and not give the benefit of net cash liability. Anyone can take up that independently.
Yeah,
Nishant, your final
exactly.
comments on budget, please. Nishant, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. So like we said that, it's an encouraging budget, macro level, really good. I think, the budget which was immediately post the pandemic has significantly impacted certain sectors of the economy. And while the finance minister has done well not to bring in a COVID cess or a COVID tax and increase the burden of the taxpayers, maybe some sort of liberalization or some sort of a support to some sectors of the economy which were really limping and which have really been affected by the pandemic would have been a helpful gesture. I think that could have been something that could have brought in. Clearly, there is a mention about the PLI and some sectors to be covered under PLI. That is in the production link. I'm hoping something similar in the service sector also comes out, a service linked incentive sort of. Which is something that we should look for because the pandemic has significantly impacted the service sector, some of the service sectors. And I think that is where the support could have been brought in. Otherwise,
Rohit, one point for Mr. Nankani I had in mind. Oh, sorry, I interrupted you. I thought you finished.
No, carry on.
Please carry on. The point I was making for Mr. Nankani was the new section 83. It's so widely worded that if Mr. Nankani takes it up, it will be thrown out because they're talking about provisional attachment even before the quantification on a rough basis is done. And that is never heard of. You start conducting an audit and start provisionally attaching somebody's goods or somebody's property. So section 83 in its proposed form is too widely worded to be sustainable to my mind.
Agree with you, Kees. And especially when it's not just about attachment of property, but when you attach bank accounts so randomly and arbitrarily, it virtually a economic debt for an assessee. Because today cash flow is a very important part of any business house, and if you are going to really stuffle them with attachment of the bank account under section 83 and that can go on for a year, I think that is it's you're being hanged before you are convicted.
That's right. I think that's
even before show cause notice, even before allegation is made.
As allegations,
right.
Rough basis, they can attach. I think very deterrent provisions. While we have overrun the time, I would want to conclude, but we have one question from our dear friend Sridhar Raman wanted to just address that. Whether the safe harbor will apply to secondary market, answer is no, because they specifically said on the first allotment and not the second sale of the goods. And therefore, it may not apply to a secondary market. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining this webinar. And it is absolutely pleasure to taking you through some of the clause-by-clause analysis of certain provisions of budget. Thank you, Vikram Bhai, and thank you, Mr. Singh, for participating on this webinar from ELP.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other point on
Thank you for